Howdy folks, so we're going to pick up where we left off talking about thermoregulation. And so at this point in the previous lectures, we've talked about cellular level adaptations, specifically in cell membranes and proteins to deal with temperature variation. And we've talked about how animals thermoregulate. Specifically, we've talked about endothermy versus ectothermy and the costs and benefits of these two different strategies that animals use. If you haven't watched these two previous lectures, please check those out before you go continue with this lecture. And where we're going to go now is we're going to talk about animal adaptations to thermoregulate, specifically three different main types of adaptations: behavioral, structural, and how surface area to volume ratios relate to some of these structural adaptations, and then physiological adaptations. So we'll begin with behavioral adaptations to thermoregulate. Behavioral adaptations are simply innate behaviors that animals have to aid in thermoregulation. And the most common example of a behavioral adaptation is whether you're an ectotherm or an endotherm. It pays to move to an area with external temperatures closest to your temperature optimum. Okay, so great examples of animals that move are migrating long distances to deal with the seasonality. So you can talk about birds migrating south for the winter so that they can go to an ideal warm habitat in wintertime, and then in summertime, at least for the northern hemisphere, they can fly back north to get to, once again, ideal sort of temperatures and breeding grounds. So this is, once again, just moving to follow the seasons. And we see this not only in birds, but other animals also migrate long distances, like wildebeests in Africa. The other thing that you can do is just move a short distance on a sort of daily basis. And you can see examples of this lizard doing it here, where they can reorient themselves to sort of align with the sun and pick up as much rays as possible. They can wallow in the water to cool off. They can take shelter to get out of the sun. They can do this thing called thermal gaping, which is essentially opening your mouth up just to release a little bit of humidity and cool off a little bit. And they can also sort of lift their body and do push-ups if they're on the really hot rocks and things like that. So there's lots of different ways that you can move short distances. These are all examples of innate behaviors that organisms have to aid in thermoregulation. Other examples of behavioral adaptations include huddling. So if you remember that documentary about the penguins in Antarctica that all sort of gather and huddle around each other to keep each other warm. That's another example of a behavioral adaptation. And dormancy is also a great example of a behavioral adaptation. So a lot of animals will go dormant during really sort of cold periods, or really, really hot periods, or really, really dry periods. And this is a great way that they can avoid the sort of temperatures that are not ideal for their sort of thermal optimum. And examples of this include hibernation, and then other terms that you may not have heard before, things like brumation, estivation, torpor, and diapause. And so I don't care so much about you knowing those terms and the intricacies of what distinguishes brumation from estivation, from torpor, from diapause, which are all different sort of degrees of dormancy, only to understand that these are all different examples of animals going into a sort of dormant phase to avoid things that are not in their temperature optimum. The other thing to note about these dormancy phases is we'll talk about, along with behavioral adaptations, we'll talk about another general type of adaptation, which is a physiological adaptation. And these behavioral adaptations are all sort of intimately linked with physiological adaptations. So there's lots of physiological things that are happening to these animals when they huddle, or when they go into dormancy, or when they move, that are sort of triggering them to have these behaviors. And so behavior and physiology are intimately linked, and these are sort of artificial sort of separations that we're creating when we talk about behavioral adaptations versus physiological adaptations. So the next type of adaptation that I want to talk about are structural adaptations for thermoregulation. When we talk about structural adaptations, really what we're talking about are just like actual anatomical morphological structures that animals have to deal with thermoregulation. And a great example of this is insulation. So this is a really most common in endothermic animals that need to maintain a constant internal temperature, as opposed to the ectotherms that also, although they do have an optimal temperature, they can have variation, or a little bit more variation in their temperature. And this is really to help maintain differential between the internal and the external temperature and keep that internally generated heat in, And so great examples of insulation are things like hair, like you see on this fox here, things like feathers that can serve as a great insulation for birds, and things like fat that we can see on birds and mammals. And a great example of that is the blubber that we see in seals. They have a really, really thick layer of blubber that helps to keep them warm and insulated in cooler temperatures, along with hair as well. Other examples of structural adaptations can include coloration, and this is something that we can see in both ectotherms and endotherms. And typically darker colors like black absorb heat much better. And you can have individual organisms that are darker colored in cooler habitats, or you can have organisms that can actually change color throughout the day depending on what their body temperature is, like the Scloporus lizard that you see here, that has its cold coloration during the colder parts of the day, so the scales can actually turn darker so that they absorb more heat and heat the lizard up to its optimal temperature. And then you can see the hot coloration here, where it's all green and it's gotten rid of a lot of those, or the black color has been reduced in it so that it's not absorbing as much heat and it stays at its optimal temperature. Another important aspect of structural adaptations are organism size and their shape. And so you can have variation in an organism's size and shape that help to enable it to thermoregulate better. And when we talk about shape, typically what we're talking about is longer, flatter shapes help to exchange heat much better, like you see in this rabbit here with the big ears. This is a jackrabbit that's in a very hot habitat, and having those big ears helps it to dissipate heat from those ears much more efficiently and stay at its thermal optimum to cool off much better on hot days. And then you have size being really important too for maintaining heat and heat exchange. So for example, you can see a polar bear is a really, really big bear, the biggest of all the bears, and that's in the coolest climates. And you can see all the way off to the right is something called a sun bear that's known to be in tropical habitats, and that's obviously the most smallest. And as you get larger and larger and larger, remember that varies your surface area to volume ratio, such that much larger organisms have a smaller surface area to volume ratio and thus can contain heat or retain heat much better than smaller organisms. So we tend to see much larger organisms in colder climates and tend to see much smaller versions of those same or similar organisms in warmer climates. So just to sort of reiterate this idea of surface area to volume ratios and their influence that they have on heat exchange, recall that if you have a higher surface area to volume ratio, you have much higher rates of heat exchange, and both shape and size increase or influence your surface area to volume ratio and therefore influence rates of heat exchange. So for example, your shape has a really big influence on your surface area to volume ratio, such that you as an individual can even change your shape so that you have a lower surface area to volume ratio, like when you're tucked all together in a ball like this image here. Or if you spread yourself out completely, you increase your surface area but keep your volume to the same, so you're increasing your surface area to volume ratio and you'll cool off much quicker. And that's why people stay huddled up on cold days, and on a hot day it helps to sort of spread out and dissipate heat to cool off. Same deal with size. So larger shapes have a lower surface area to volume ratio, and that's because surface area increases at a sort of squared rate, whereas volume increases at a cubic rate. So your volume increases much more quickly than your surface area does. If you recall that activity that we practiced calculating surface area to volume ratios for different size cubes, that larger cube has a much lower surface area to volume ratio. Because it has less surface area relative to its volume, it conserves heat much better. And so this idea of shape and size influencing surface area to volume ratios in turn influence rates of heat exchange, where if you have a lower surface area to volume ratio, you have less surface area to dissipate heat relative to your volume, and you retain heat much better. And so you can think of this being like that jackrabbit with really big ears has a really high surface area to volume ratio on its ears, and so it'll exchange heat and dissipate heat and cool off much better. Whereas this rabbit that's snowshoe hare in a cooler habitat has much smaller ears, so that it retains heat much better. And so it's decreasing its surface area to volume ratio to retain heat better. And same deal with the polar bear versus the sun bear. That polar bear is much larger. It's got a lower surface area to volume ratio because it's larger, and it's going to retain heat much better. And that's why polar bears are part of the reason, or the argument for why polar bears are so big, is because it allows them to retain heat much better in that cold habitat. So the last type of adaptation that I want to talk about are physiological adaptations for thermoregulation. And so physiological adaptations are just types of adaptations that are initiated on a physiological basis. So basically you have natural physiological responses and structures in your body that sort of innately respond to cool you off. And so examples of this would be evaporative cooling that's initiated by sweating. So if you overheat, you sweat a lot. So you have a physiological response that gets turned on in sweat glands that'll produce that sweat that covers your skin. That sweat will basically evaporate off your body, and as it evaporates, it'll cool you off real bad. So think about, or really well. So think about like when you get in a swimming pool or when you get out of the swimming pool right away, your body cools off really quickly. You get really cold when you get out of the pool, right? And so when that happens, that's evaporative cooling that's happening, and that's what sweat's doing for you. In dogs, they can't sweat, so instead they pant, but it's the same idea of just basically getting that moisture out and having evaporative cooling to cool them off. Another example of a physiological adaptation is when you get really cold, you'll shiver. And so this is a natural physiological response that you often can't control if you get too cold. And that shivering is basically your muscles flexing really quickly, and that shivering generates heat to warm your body up. Another example of a physiological adaptation are vasoconstriction and vasodilation. So basically, vasoconstriction is basically your blood vessels just constricting and getting smaller, versus vasodilation, which is your blood vessels sort of expanding and getting looser. That allows more blood flow close to the surface of the skin. And then that blood flow, in turn, allows for increased heat loss through the skin. And so vasodilating will get blood closer to the skin and allow heat to be lost through the skin, so more lost to the environment. So this is another physiological response that allows you to cool off more quickly and better. And please recall this induced responses activity for how organisms sort of regulate or respond to the environment. And so we talked about this idea that every sort of induced response involves a stimulus, a sensor and a signal transducer, an effector and a response. And we compared the human sort of response system to heat to a thermostat and a heater. So just like a thermostat, humans have a hypothalamus. And then that hypothalamus responds to being at the not optimal temperature, and that in turn will create basically a response, a physiological response. In this case, the muscles will shiver in response to that. So basically it sends a signal down through your central nervous system, out the nerves to tell your muscles to shiver. That shivering muscle acts like a heater. It'll create heat. And basically that heat will eventually heat up the hypothalamus to tell you to stop shivering once you get back up to a safe body temperature. So in the same way, you can have other physiological responses, whether it's shivering, whether it's vasodilation, whether it's vasoconstriction, whether it's sweating. And not all of these things are initiated necessarily by the hypothalamus. There can be other things that initiate them, but it's the same sort of system. So it's important to recall this idea of how responses are induced and how organisms can use these physiological responses to thermoregulate and maintain a homeostasis, and if you are an endothermic animal, a constant internal temperature. Other sort of extreme examples of physiological adaptations that we see for thermoregulation in animals. Some animals are extreme thermoconformers. In fact, there's 12 different species of amphibians that are known to actually be freeze tolerant. And so this physiological response isn't so much to maintain a constant body temperature, but to be able to survive at a very, very cool body temperature. So what will happen is when temperatures get really, really cold, some frogs will release a bunch of glucose out of their liver into the rest of their cells of their body. And what that glucose does is it prevents the intracellular space from freezing and maintains osmolality to prevent cell damage. So essentially what these frogs can do is get completely frozen for all the way up to 2 weeks. And what this does is it allows them to stay at sort of colder temperatures. So normally what frogs will do is they'll go dig themselves down, either down into the mud below a pond or down into like sort of safe spaces and holes and caves where it doesn't get that cold. But this allows them to basically be functional in the springtime and be at surface temperatures and to even freeze, to allow them to have a lot of activity in the late fall and early spring so that they can breed and feed during these seasons and freeze a little bit, and it's not that big of a deal, which is pretty remarkable that they can freeze and survive. Another crazy example of physiological adaptations for thermoregulation in animals are these dormancy periods. Okay, so we talked about dormancy. Basically, it's just a period in an organism's life when either growth or development or physical activity are temporarily stopped or greatly reduced. And as a result, body temperatures can go way, way down outside of their optimal range, but organisms can still survive despite having way, way, way reduced body temperatures. And that's because a lot of the sort of metabolic activity that's associated with maintaining that optimal body temperature are not required because the metabolisms and other activities are turned way down. And there's tons of sort of like physiological and hormonal things that have to happen in an animal to enable this sort of metabolic slowdown that's necessary for the dormant period to happen. So when we talk about things like hibernation, we can look at this example in this 13-line ground squirrel where you can see its normal temperature in the summer. So here we're looking at the body temperature of a typical 13-line ground squirrel. And then we can see in the summer period, it stays up around 38 degrees. And in the springtime, it's up around 38 degrees. And then you have this hibernation period from October through about April, where its body temperature, resting body temperature, goes down to about 5 degrees. And it has these little spikes where it's has interbout arousals, which basically means it's waking up for a little bit. But for the most part, its body temperature stays way, way down. And as you can imagine, there's a whole bunch of sort of physiological and hormonal things that need to happen to enable the body temperature, the organism's metabolism to go down that low, and for its body temperature to be able to stay that low without killing the organisms. And so the sort of take home here is that there's a lot of physiological mechanisms involved in reducing metabolism and reducing the body temperature requirements for this typical for this 13-line ground squirrel that's typically an endothermic animal that needs to maintain a high body temperature. So just as a quick recap, when we're talking about dealing with temperature, at this point we've talked about cellular level adaptations that organisms have involving membrane permeability and stopping proteins from denaturing in high temperatures. We've talked about how animals thermoregulate and the difference between endothermic animals versus ectothermic animals and the cost and benefits of being endothermic versus ectothermic. And we've also now talked about some animal adaptations to thermoregulate. Specifically, we've talked about behavioral, structural, and physiological adaptations that these different organisms have evolved. And this is by no means a comprehensive list of all the behavioral, structural, and physiological adaptations that organisms have to thermoregulate. It's just meant to give you some examples of things that they of each of these types of adaptations. One last point that I want to drive home is that with both behavioral and physiological adaptations, any behavior is going to be linked to physiological changes, and oftentimes physiological changes are going to be linked to behaviors. And so these, in a lot of ways, are sort of artificial terms in the sense that physiological and behavioral adaptations are not completely separated and mutually exclusive from one another. Behavioral adaptations for thermoregulation require physiological changes, and physiological changes often result in behavioral changes to thermoregulate.